Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, StriveUK welcomes you to our Thafakkur series on tackling Islamophobia, particularly gendered Islamophobia, organized by StriveUK to mark Islamophobia Awareness Month. Dear brothers and sisters, before we dive into the session today, which I'm sure you all are waiting for, let me give you a quick intro about StriveUK. I'm sure most of you here know about Strive and its activities, but for the benefit of those who are joining us for the first time today. So StriveUK was founded in 2017 and are a small network of diverse British Muslims. We have at the core of our mission the mission of representing Islam in its beauty, with the firm understanding that this beauty of Islam can only be comprehended in its totality. We move forward with the conviction that Allah rightly guides those who strive for His cause. To realize this mission, Strive focuses on advocacy for social justice and equality, to influence public attitudes, state policy, and laws to create a more socially just society. Dawah, charity, outreach, joining hands with like-minded organizations in presenting Islam as the totality of life, highlighting its emancipatory aspects, while also investing in the tazkiyah and tarbiyah of ourselves, the continuous improvement of moral and spiritual character, learning, and development. Alhamdulillah, in this brief space, we have managed to host regular seminars and workshops for adults and children on themes and topics of contemporary relevance to create social awareness. We have mobilized campaigns. We took to the streets across several cities in the UK in support of just causes across the globe for oppressed Palestinians, Uyghurs, Rohingyans, Indian Muslims, etc. We conducted a couple of editions of the very, very popular Women's Conference and brought together some of the country's most inspirational women activists to help fight the institutional misogyny and Islamophobia. We have partnered with relief organizations and delivered aid worth more than £50,000 across the world. At StriveUK, we recognize that Islamophobia is the greatest challenge that the Ummah is facing, and that Islamophobia seeks to alter Islam, belief, practice, and life. As Islamophobia endangers the Muslim existence, it is a duty upon each and one of us to comprehend it and to fight against it. Tackling Islamophobia has been a focus area for StriveUK right from the start, and we have also conducted several events in association with organizations like UKIM, CAGE, MEND, Malayali Muslim Community, etc., with many of the leading experts in the field, like Dr. Tajul Islam, Professor Salman Sayed, Dr. Azim Qureshi. These sessions have focused on garnering a very correct understanding of Islamophobia that will both illuminate the complex nature of the system of Islamophobia and enable resistance to it. As we are painfully aware, gendered Islamophobia is an existential reality. Muslim women have been the object of verbal and physical harassment. In particular, many Muslim women who wore the hijab shared newfound or heightened anxiety and fear about being visibly and identifiably Muslim, even in their own hometowns and familiar local spaces. Although perhaps exacerbated, these conversations are not new and have become more and more frequent with the rise of populist and nationalist sentiments across the Western world and across the rest of the globe. To throw light on this subject, we have two exemplary women as our guest speakers today. They have tirelessly strived to challenge the mainstream narrative and make the voices of the oppressed heard among the dominant. So, dear brothers and sisters, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Amina Easat-Daas. I hope I've pronounced it correctly, Dr. Das. She's an early career academic fellow in the Center for Urban Research on Austerity at De Montfort University, Leicester. She's also a module leader and lectures on the undergraduate Global Comparative Politics module. Her research interests include the study of Muslim women, Muslim youth, Islamophobia, and creatively countering Islamophobia in Europe, gender dimensions of Islamophobia, and European Islam. In her capacity as an emerging Islamophobia studies specialist, she has been invited and has presented her research findings to the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and the Carter Center, among others, and has appeared on national and international media on numerous occasions to discuss Muslim current affairs. Sister Amina, welcome to today's session organized by StriveUK.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and in such great company of women speakers, women moderators, and women organisers at the front of all of this. So as you've so kindly highlighted, so I'm actually a lecturer in politics at De Montfort University in Leicester in the UK, and I generally specialise in sort of and politics, naturally, comparative politics. I look at French and Belgian politics quite a lot, quite heavily. So I'll draw on those in my contribution today. In addition, I look at Muslim women's political participation, as well as my more broader work in terms of Islamophobia studies, and particularly gendered Islamophobia. So I guess one of the important questions that really we ought to be asking at the outset of my contribution, why should we consider gendered Islamophobia? And perhaps we need to take a step back and question what is gendered Islamophobia in the first place. What is it that we're talking about? So within my own work, I employ the definition that's adopted by the MCB, who StriveUK are affiliated with as well, that was also put through the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims in the UK. So I understand it as a form of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or even perceived Muslimness. And this helps us understand how a broad variety of individuals are impacted or affected by Islamophobia. And it goes beyond just Muslims themselves. And that's one of the important things to remember, that this is not just a Muslim problem, rather it's a societal problem. It's about understanding what we might want our society to be and what we might want it to represent, and the kind of challenges that Islamophobia as a form of racism presents to this idea of a cohesive civic society that we might aspire to. So moving on from that, the gendered dimensions of Islamophobia, I'm quite interested in the different ways in which Islamophobia impacts across the genders, primarily across men and women. How do they differently experience Islamophobia? And we could draw parallels here with gendered anti-Semitism or gendered Romophobia, for example. It sits within this family of gendered racisms. Why then? Returning to my question of why should we look at gendered Islamophobia? So through the course of my research, looking at both the UK, France, Belgium, and internationally, I found that Muslim women, and perhaps this is no surprise to many of us, Muslim women are disproportionately impacted by Islamophobia. And often we hear about the very explicit manifestations of Islamophobia. And this can sort of vary from things like denial of service, so not being able to access spaces, be that schools, public transport, be that picking their children up from schools, as a case persists in the French sphere. We then have exclusion themselves from particular activities, exclusion from society, the workplace, the labour market. And we also continue to see things like going along this spectrum, Muslim women disproportionately face attack, be that verbal attack or physical attacks. Countless stories of Muslim women being, and I apologise for the trigger in advance, Muslim women being spat upon, Muslim women having their hijabs ripped off their heads. And this continues along this spectrum, the kind of prejudice, discrimination, and attack that Muslim women are disproportionately facing. We see it culminating in the very worst examples of Muslim women losing their lives at the hands of gendered Islamophobia. One such prominent case is that of Marwa al-Sharbini in Germany in 2009, who lost her life, and it's considered to be an Islamophobic gendered hate crime that took place there. So we see disproportionately Muslim women face the effects. And this is a finding that's replicated in the statistical evidence. So year on year in my own research, I find that British organisations, but also organisations on the continent, such as the Counter-Islamophobia Collective in Belgium, or the now disbanded, should we say transformed, Counter-Islamophobia Collective in France, finding year on year that the rates at which those who come to report Islamophobia to these monitoring organizations and advocacy organizations, remember that's just the tip of the iceberg, it's a question of who actually goes forward to report. But amongst those who report experiences of Islamophobia, it tends to be in about the 90% on average, year on year across the continent. And I cite these examples coming from Francophone Europe or Britain, but actually, given the globalizing nature of Islamophobia, the way in which we see it, not just as an issue in the global north or the global west, but actually, and as Sister Zarina alluded to, something that might be an issue in, say, for example, the global south in India, we're likely to see these statistics represented or replicated elsewhere across the globe. But actually, also, there's a question of looking beyond the explicit, and this is something that I do in my own work. So the explicit are these examples of hate crime that we see reported, and documented quite well. Beyond the explicit, I do a lot of this sort of work in my own research, looking at perhaps the less obvious forms of gendered Islamophobia, looking at the structural, embedded practices of gendered Islamophobia. And it's my argument in my own work, I argue that the structural, so these systems that are in place, and I'll give some examples as I continue, these systems that are in place enable the physical, legitimize the physical explicit expressions of Islamophobia. So neither is existing in a vacuum, rather the two are cyclically interrelated and work together. So what do I mean when I talk about structural Islamophobia? One of the key examples that I see quite a lot in my own work might be examples of legislation. So that could be policy and laws that are passed. Policy and laws that are passed that disproportionately impact Muslim women. And in my work and my research experience as a Francophone European specialist, I would be remiss not to begin by talking about France. And in a lot of my work, I find that France really is a bit of a barometer, a catalyst. So we see the bar potentially being set in the French context, and it being a signal to much of wider Europe and now globally. So one such example of this sort of disproportionately targeted legislation would be, we could recall the example of the 2004 implemented loi Stasi, the Stasi law in France. The Stasi law followed significant political hysteria, media coverage, even a commission looking into the potential effects, and a law was arrived upon by 2004 and enacted by 2004 that sought to ban, quote unquote, ostentatious faith symbols in schools. Why did we even arrive at that point? A lot of the French legal gendered Islamophobia that we see tends to find its rootings in principles of secularism, the idea of a separation of church and state. There's much research evidence to point to the fact that perhaps it's no longer about a separation of religion and state, rather it has become a vehicle through which Muslimness in the country is targeted. Lo and behold, after the 2004 ban and this discussion around ostentatious faith symbols, we saw that certain symbols were acceptable and certain symbols were deemed to be unacceptable. Among those, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the hijab worn by young Muslim girls in French schools, and perhaps maybe even collaterally young Sikh men, young Sikh boys who were baptized Sikhs and wore the turban, being excluded en masse from French education. And the questions I ask myself, not only does this signal in the present about the acceptability, the them and the us, the binaries that it creates, the other questions I ask myself are, what are the broader ramifications of all of this? And I found in my own work, and there is significant testimony that exists to suggest that this didn't only signal publicly and societally what was deemed to be French and what was deemed to be an acceptable form of Frenchness or Europeanness at a given time. It also limited young French Muslim women predominantly, but arguably other faith groups, from inserting themselves into the education system, not only in the present, but in the future. Without an education, to what extent could they legitimately insert themselves easily into society? So here perhaps we see, through a structural paradigm, we have the sort of current banning, but actually part of what's going on is the limit on Muslim women's futures as well. And we see other cycles of the ways in which Muslim women are framed as being these outsiders who do not participate in society, being exacerbated and compounded by their exclusion from the French education system. And not only that, the 2004 law in France has been replicated. So my work on Belgium, there are localized bans that exist around banning young girls from wearing hijab. But it's not just a European issue. In fact, many of you might recall the Ofsted saga in 2018, whereby there was arguably a problematization or maybe even sexualization of young girls who wore hijab in British schools. And this, again, whether or not legislation passes, whether or not bans occur or don't occur, the discourse, the narrative around it, the discussion around it is happening. Muslimness is problematized in society through these frames. We might also consider, if we're looking at structural Islamophobia, looking at further examples of legislation, I think about the 2010 French, as it's commonly banned, the loi anti-niqab, the anti-niqab law, but as it's formally known within law, the loi contre la dissimulation du visage, the law against the concealment of one's face. And that for me sits really interestingly, and I see some of the hypocrisies and maybe contradictions. If in 2010 it was so dangerous to cover one's face and a threat to secularism to cover one's face in France, how then has mask wearing happened in the present? How has that problem been navigated? Or how has that danger, alleged danger, been circumvented? And we saw 2010 happening in France, 2011, Belgium, but that list continues. You have Austria and so on and so forth. And the countries that have had debates around it, again, that narrative, that discussion, that problematization, that signaling of Muslim women who cover in certain ways, or Muslim women who exist as Muslim women, their presence, their very bodies being a problem within certain societies. And it doesn't need to be that political discussion around bans. It doesn't need to be the implementation of bans. Coming closer to home, we could think about PM Boris Johnson's comments on Muslim women as letterboxes. Organizations found that there was a 375% increase thereafter in gendered Islamophobic hate crimes. There is an excellent piece of work by Witham and Ali that has some more of the qualitative nuances, some of the Muslim experiences, both of men and women, off the back of these comments around Muslim women as letterboxes. So you have this structural that facilitates debate and discussion, that facilitates the signaling of Muslim women as outsiders. And essentially what happens is the Muslim woman, the figure of the Muslim woman as other, becomes symbolic of all of society's ills, and whether that's issues or alleged issues pertaining to migration, arguably broader neoliberal crises, or questions around securitization narratives, and I'm sure there are others who could speak to this more than I can. We have the figure of the Muslim woman constructed as an ill to society, and one that must be regulated. So regulated by law, but also regulated by the everyday to facilitate and legitimize the interpersonal attacks upon Muslim women. We then have that cyclical nature whereby the vote, then, if we think about the kind of femo-nationalist or nationalist discourses that exist around gendered Muslimness, the idea then to appease the voters or to even appeal to the voters, one must engage in this narrative, one must make political pledges and campaigns around these frames. We see this kind of constant feeding of a gendered Islamophobic explicit interpersonal climate, but also of a political and structural climate. In much of my work, I argue that the construction of Muslim women and Muslim men is in fact not something new. The issue or the alleged issue of a Muslim woman is not a new one. Rather, it finds its roots in sort of orientalized discourses whereby Muslim women are framed as submissive or passive, voiceless, without agency, but also gatekeepers to these allegedly barbaric Muslim men. So we have these kind of historically rooted, and if we think about these discourses, these orientalist discourses, as having existed during the colonial period, then given the kind of post-colonial constitution of many of Europe's Muslim communities, but also globally, those kind of dynamics of the colonial power that exist, you have this further fuel added to the legitimization. So, for example, some of these legislations that I've talked about around the hijab or the niqab, they're framed as being a good thing because Muslim women couldn't possibly be wanting to cover. And I'm not saying there aren't Muslim women who are forced to cover. That would be particularly short-sighted. But in my own work, many of the Muslim women I encounter, and perhaps because I encounter them as politically active Muslim women, the idea then is because they're all forced without agency to cover, bans on Muslim clothing become seen as a sort of act of a sort of a colonial savior, a white savior type act. So then we have the further entrenchment of the them and us binaries and the further entrenchment of the power relations that exist around gendered Islamophobia. But in much of my work, I found that, I'm increasingly interested and have been working on questions of countering Islamophobia since 2017 onwards. And much of my research in this area shows that these narratives, or arguably earlier than this in my work with Muslim women in politics, shows that these narratives around Muslim women as lacking agency, as lacking voice, as being oppressed, as being in need of a savior, are in fact deeply untrue. That there are many Muslim women active in society who participate in all manner of projects, whether that's being a local, regional, or European level parliamentarian, whether that's participating in trade unions I found in my own work, or increasingly I'm interested in the creative expressions of Muslimness that persist or that flourish even in society. We have, for example, interfaith work. I'm honoured to be joined as a co-speaker of Suhaiymah, an outstanding poet, who really is showing incredibly her voice and agency and position as a Muslim woman. Interfaith work, for example, is yet another one of these examples, another one of these great projects that exist whereby Muslim women are very much at the helm and leading in countering and challenging some of the views that exist or some of the narratives that exist around themselves, around them as a group. One of the things that I've also found in my work, that given the intersectionally diverse nature of their identities, that this pathway towards countering Islamophobia or gendered Islamophobia specifically is certainly not an easy one. So Muslim women not only face the way in which, or face the prejudice and discrimination arising from the way in which they are constructed as Muslim, and the problems that exist, or the Islamophobic narratives that exist around Muslimness, but we also see them fighting an uphill battle around gender. And if we remember society, or if we remark society as a more patriarchal society, Muslim women find themselves needing to struggle against narratives around Muslimness, but also to struggle around the patriarchal systems in place. And that might come from things like childcare or domestic responsibilities, and needing to fight those battles in order to be able to do what it is they want to do and what they are actually capable of doing. In addition to this, we see that often Muslim women are racialized in distinct ways. And this, again, is another uphill climb often for Muslim women. This is before we start to think about these hugely different interpersonal characteristics of Muslim women in terms of their age, or even disability, or not having a disability, and this sort of intersectional, and I use the work of Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black American theorist and thinker, in understanding that actually, yes, some of this countering work is going on, and it's exemplary, but understanding that the struggles, or the climb is definitely an intersectional, is definitely a multi-layered, multi-level one for Muslim women. And I'm sort of coming to the end of my contribution. One of the questions I ask myself, and I draw on Suhaiymah's work here actually, around the idea of all these brilliant things that Muslim women do, that, you know, they are ambassadors. In my own work, I interview women who are ambassadors, women who are MEPs, women who are MPs, women who sit in the House of Lords, women who lead local councils, who lead significant charity organizations, who are head teachers at school, who are mothers, who have a whole variety of different roles and different elements of themselves that they contribute to society in so many ways, and do so much good. And for a lot of them, I find that they draw on all of this, from all of this. A lot of this is drawn from their religious identities, but also their gendered identities. And I can't help but think, and it's a question for me as a researcher that plays in the back of my mind, around Suhaiymah's "This is not a humanizing poem." And maybe some of that work that we need to do isn't always about showcasing all the amazing things they do, but rather understanding within the frame of gendered Islamophobia that Muslim women, or any other racialized woman, deserve, or any woman for that matter, or any individual in society, deserves to be respected in society, deserves to be valued in society, just because they are a person within society, just because they are part of this community, or any broader society that we may conceive of. They don't need to be all singing, all dancing, as Suhaiymah highlights. So yes, in my own work, I do highlight a lot of these amazing things they do. But in fact, maybe some of this work that we need to be doing at the political level is about valuing Muslim women just as people in society, who happen to be all singing, all dancing, and contributing in a wide variety of ways. But thank you ever so much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I look forward to your questions.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Amina. I mean, it was an eye opener. Your talk. I mean, it is an uphill task to challenge gendered Islamophobia, but I think creating awareness like this goes a long way. It greatly contributes to breaking shackles. So, inshallah, there's more work to be done, but I think as a society, it is our duty to do more. So, our next renowned speaker today, after that excellent talk by Sister Amina, is Sister Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, and I'm sure most of us here do know who she is, because she's a very famous writer, poet, and educator, and she's disrupting understandings of history, race, knowledge, and violence. She works to equip herself and others with the tools and faith to resist the unlivable conditions that we find ourselves in and to work towards another reality. So Sister Suhaiymah is the co-author of A Fly Girl's Guide to University, author of Post-Colonial Banter, Entangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. She's written for The Guardian, The Independent, Al Jazeera, and Galdem. So Hima's poetry has millions of views online, and I'm sure many of us here have heard her poems. And she has featured across radio and TV stations. She won the National Roundhouse Poetry Slam runner-up in 2017, and she's currently a visiting research fellow in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London and writer in residence at the West Yorkshire Playhouse. Sister Suhaiymah, we are honored to have you join us here today.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for that introduction. I just want to begin by saying, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an absolute honor to be in such a fantastically attended event, mashallah. It's really exciting to see so many people wanting to engage in this conversation. And I'm sure you can all agree that Dr. Amina's contribution will be very difficult to follow. Mashallah, I think we covered so much important ground. So in what I share today, I'll be kind of using some of my poetry as prompts to kind of, maybe keep everybody awake. I know it's hard to listen for a long time, but also to, I suppose, point to some of the points that I want to make in addition to, I guess, the groundwork that has been so brilliantly laid. So I'll also be reading short excerpts from my book, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia, which inshallah will come out next year, just because it's easier sometimes to not reproduce work. And I think I'll kind of use that as well as prompts for myself. So one of the things that I wanted us to think about is how the experiences of Muslim women, the position of Muslim women, in my opinion, is one that actually helps us to really see the bigger structural elements of Islamophobia. And I think there are many examples of that we've just heard in the earlier contribution. And what I'm really interested in is thinking about how, I suppose, the current narrative when in a broader, in Britain more broadly, when it comes to Muslim women and it comes to gendered Islamophobia, does focus specifically on hate crimes. And I think that terminology in of itself is really interesting to think about, right? Are these crimes of hate? Or are these crimes, or are these in fact manifestations and expressions of a top-down narrative that Dr. Amina has just spent a good amount of time explaining to us? And so what I'm interested in thinking about is, beyond just thinking about these individualized acts of violence that of course are harrowing, that can be really traumatic when you experience, or if you experience them, and even if you don't experience them, can kind of cause you to be very hypervigilant as a Muslim woman in society, moving through public spaces. But beyond that, what happens if we think about the root causes? Like I say, what do Muslim women's experiences actually highlight about the contradictions within Islamophobia as well? I want to begin by reading a poem from my collection, and it was actually a poem that I wrote in response to being asked this question, what does it mean to be a Muslim woman? And hopefully this poem can kind of begin with some of the contradictions I want us to explore. So what does it mean to be a Muslim woman? To be a Muslim woman is to never speak for oneself, to never exist for oneself, but for everyone else. To know that even when you speak, you are not heard unless it fits the narrative. To exist only to justify your existence. To be a Muslim woman is to be asked but already decided. A political pawn, a justification for invasion, a weapon to strike against Islam. It is to be always an object of fascination, veiled body, object of desire, mystery body, object of ridicule, letterbox body, always an object. To be a Muslim woman is to be represented or representative, but never real. Even to correct misrepresentation, you are reduced to other representations. To be a Muslim woman is to be picture, but never painter. To be surreal, uncanny, not quite. To be an outsider to yourself, a conversation, a joke, a jibe. It is to be always already framed. To be made excruciatingly small and impossibly big at once. To be swallowed and vomited out at the same time. To be a Muslim woman is to be always fought over, but never fought for. I wanted to begin with that because I think that that idea of who a Muslim woman is being reduced to the ways that we're represented has kind of contributed to the position where perhaps we often feel that the way to resist gendered Islamophobia, to resist the kind of violence that we face, is through better representation, right? And that better representation includes a whole host of, the amazing things that Dr. Amina has kind of just indicated that so many Muslim women do, and we know they do. But I suppose what I want to think about is whether representation in of itself is the issue, because if it's not, then in kind of advancing better representation, perhaps we're not tackling the root cause of the problem. And I would say that how we're represented is really the symptom of the different ideological and material, financial usually, motives that representations of Muslims serve. So what do I mean? As a small example, we can think about the way that representing Muslim women as mothers who are potentially radicalizing forces, potentially dangerous forces, that representation legitimizes surveillance of their children through counter-extremism, through Prevent, and it legitimizes approaching them also as suspects to be criminalized. And there are beneficiaries to that, right? The state, which gets to kind of extend its surveillance networks, gets to kind of coerce how you think, how you express yourself. And also, financially, you have technology companies, you have think tanks who produce research, you have security industries that benefit from that representation too. And so I think if we trace out the lines, we see that actually the construction of Muslim women in the ways that we are constructed, the various and often contradictory, as we'll come to, ways, isn't sort of just an accidental fact of, hatred or just, cruelty and malice, but actually there are very real reasons that it exists. And when we identify that, if we can address that, then maybe we were actually getting to the root of things. So I'm just going to read a short paragraph from a chapter in my book that really focuses on gendered Islamophobia, and I'm going to use that as a prompt to talk about some things. So I talk about how images of Muslim women in hijab and niqab permeate our day. They are splayed under newspaper headlines, moving through the landscapes of TV documentaries and accompanying stories as varied as COVID, women's rights, terrorism, the EU, and unemployment rates. I say, so far in this book, we've established how Muslim women are viewed as crucial links in counter-terrorism, integration, and counter-extremism initiatives, which see our homes, languages, dress, and birth rates requiring regulation or co-option. And I just want to pause there for a moment, because these things that I talk about, the way that Muslim women are seen as requiring regulation, especially through narratives to do with our homes, our languages, dress, and birth rates, is actually important to just visit for a second. So how is it that our homes are represented as needing regulation? Well, in the first place, if you think about it, Muslim women are in general actually not considered, they're usually considered as mothers, right? It's usually the construction of Muslim women is as reproducers. And I think that's quite interesting in of itself. And, it comes in a mix of ways, whether it's fears around us being jihadi brides, or whether it's fears around us being submissive and kind of, under the heel of patriarchal husbands. It's always in, I would argue, often at least in the context of being within a nuclear family unit or an extended family unit. And as such, I think we're constructed also to be the reproducers of the culture that children, Muslim children, receive and grow up within. And that's actually something really important, because historically, governments and states have been really interested in regulating women and the way and the things that women do and the way that womanhood is represented, because of this very desire to actually recognize, or because of the very recognition that often in societies and the ways they're structured, it is women who reproduce culture through kind of the norms that they pass on to their children, through the habits, the languages, customs, whatever. And I think it's really interesting then that the way that Muslim women are positioned as is threatening in that sense, right? Because they're going to reproduce, this is the way it's thought about, they're going to reproduce a culture that is is dangerous, right? Because Muslimness is equated with danger, with threat, with barbarism. And that's why it then matters. And that's why we hear so much conversation, I would argue, around how Muslim women dress, what language Muslim women speak at home. Because these concerns aren't really about us. I would say they're actually more about the idea that there is some unintelligible, kind of unknown, inaccessible Muslimness that is reproduced within homes that the state cannot enter, cannot access. And so I would argue this also justifies lots of the surveillance we see in public spaces through Prevent, as you'll all be aware, because that the idea that there is something that is uncontrollable, that is unknown, that goes on in Muslim homes, that children are raised within, is one that justifies that kind of surveillance. And you see actually even when and Hugs, Helping Households Under Great Stress, a fantastic charity, one of I think the only charity in the UK that really support families affected by counter-terror legislation. You can read lots of the testimonies of their clients on their website, and actually it's really interesting because in some of them, when their homes are raided, counter-terror police will take or investigate or inspect items as mundane as nappies, right? Nappies, glasses, prescriptions, medicine. And it's this idea that actually the entire home is suspect, right? Because of the taint of the Muslim woman. And I would argue that, concerns around how we dress and all those other things are also to do with kind of the hope that a more moderate Muslimness can be cultivated within the home. And therefore, we're weaponized within that idea of de-radicalization, that whole discourse, which I'll come to in a second. Another example of the ways that Muslim women are regulated, or the kind of narratives used to try to regulate our lives. I'm sure a lot of you might remember in 2015, David Cameron made the announcement that Muslim women need to learn to speak English. Kind of ignoring the fact that English as a second language classes, I think the funding for that had been cut by, I can't remember the exact statistic, but like a significant amount throughout 5 years of austerity. But on top of that, he made the link that, this assumption, this presumed link that Muslim women not speaking English, which, by the way, like no numbers around that, right? Just this assumption that Muslim women don't speak English, and linking that directly to the radicalization of their children, right? So again, you see it's us as reproducers. If you don't speak English, you're going to speak to your children in a language which apparently is more permeable to, and he talked about it being directly linked to joining ISIS, which is fascinating, right? So your language is then also linked to the potential of violence that your children or those that are kind of you reproduce may have. And so your position then as a radicalizer, basically, Muslim women are radicalizing forces. And this is why, because they're potentially radicalizing, they must be co-opted. We have to intervene. They must speak English, or they must, dress in this way, or they must do X, Y, Z thing. And, another example of this, I mentioned birth rates earlier. If you look at some of the literature around social integration, there's a report by Louise Casey in 2016-17, I think. And one of the really interesting things she highlights as a problem, one of the problems for integration in this country is the high birth rates. And she specifically highlights of Pakistani mothers. And we know that in the UK, Pakistani and Bangladeshi, unfortunately, is conflated in general to mean Muslim. But she talks about the high birth rates of Pakistani mothers as a problem, as a threat to integration, right? And again, I would say this again kind of reinforces this idea that the reproduction of racial others, of Muslims, is a reproduction that is seen to be threatening to the nation, to the future of the nation, because you're reproducing children who are cast as threats, as violent, as et cetera, and so. I think that that's a really interesting just set of ideas to think about, because what it shows us is that through Islamophobic narratives, Muslim women are simultaneously seen to be radicalizers and de-radicalizers, right? Depending on whether we can intervene and we can teach them English, they could de-radicalize their children. And if we don't, they'll be radicalizing them. They're seen as producers of otherness and preventers of otherness, right? Their high birth rates, they're going to keep producing a ton of Muslims. That's really dangerous for the future of the nation. It's going to create segregation. It's going to create all these problems that are attributed to us, of course, because we don't talk about racism. Or they're going to be producers, or they're going to be preventers of otherness, right? If we can actually intervene in their kind of upbringing or their habits and customs and that kind of thing. And in either case, we see that Muslim women are actually deemed really important in the sense that really instrumental, and actually co-opting Muslim women and our identities and our experiences is really important. And you see throughout the early 2000s in particular, a lot of early prevent funding was channeled, so you have half of it channeled to the Home Office that goes to kind of direct criminalization that usually affects men. And then you have the other half through the Department for Communities and Local Governance. And a lot of this money went towards projects that had, titles to do with empowering Muslim women, providing role models to Muslim women, and this idea that actually, as part of preventing terrorism, empowering Muslim women fell within that. And that's really fascinating, right? Because I think what it actually indicates is that Muslim women are deemed a kind of a really of high potential if you can co-opt and if you can shape and, I suppose, socially engineer who and what the Muslim woman is, then you can engineer the entire Muslim community, is the argument, right? And of course, that stands in contradiction to the idea that Muslim women are dominated by the rest of the community and have no influence. So there is a contradiction there, but it's interesting. And this isn't just something that existed in the early 2000s. In recent years, I myself have kind of clashed with a couple of these kind of projects that are much more subtle now, but you can look on Instagram and you can find there's an Instagram page called Super Sisters. And there was kind of a big expose, I suppose, around this last year or 2 years ago, where Super Sisters appears to be a very just, kind of harmless Instagram page that is kind of aimed at Muslim girls and teenage girls and girls of color. But actually it is indirectly a Home Office project in the sense that the Home Office contracts PR companies. This is under counter-extremism, who then work with and produce these kinds of really innocuous projects. But actually, because it's come from that background, we can begin to consider that these projects, like an Instagram page like that, are actually serving or attempting to cultivate a form of Muslim girlhood, Muslim teenagehood that is apolitical, right? That is not really concerned with the things that are perceived to fall under the banner of radicalization, right? And I would argue, I would personally say cultivating a type of Muslim teenagehood that is not Islamic, right? That is not encouraging you to stand for justice, that is not encouraging you to speak truth to power or, follow the sunnah in these ways, but instead that is kind of, just celebrating Muslim women becoming CEOs and this kind of thing, and kind of participating in capitalism, becoming the capitalists, which, I guess there's another conversation. We can argue whether there really is space to do that, and, whether that really does fall within what we should be trying to do. But the point being that you can see socially engineering Muslim women, Muslim girlhood, Muslim teenagehood is something that the state is genuinely invested in, right? That, why else would counter-extremism money be going to contract PR companies to produce strange Instagram pages that are aimed at Muslim girls? It kind of shows there is a lot of importance in that from the perspective of the state. So to move on a little bit, I just wanted to read a little bit more from this. So I kind of say Islamophobia has always had specific implications and manifestations for women. However, it's generally only acknowledged as harming us when it takes the form of explicit attacks. And in such instances, the solution to aggression is usually proposed through urging that Muslim women break stereotypes and challenge narratives or celebrate our inclusion in marketing campaigns. Think of Nike hijabs, H&M adverts, and music videos. Such conversations and projects avoid seriously considering what conditions are actually required for Muslim women to be safe in our everyday lives. They misdirect our attention from the fact that it's state-sanctioned surveillance and mutation of well-being services, whether that's schools and hospitals, into policing operations that makes our safety impossible. Our hijabs are pulled off in the street because they are criminalized at state level. We are called terrorists on the bus because we are constructed as terrorists in public policy. But Muslim women's experiences of violence are instead deliberately misread as somehow our own fault, stemming from a cultural shyness and submissiveness, hence the incessant focus on breaking stereotypes rather than breaking systems. Alternatively, any violence facing Muslim women is presumed an outcome of patriarchal Muslim men and Islam, not any other context or material conditions. And that means that even our oppression is often weaponized against us to justify criminalization of our families and communities. So in all the rhetorical concern for Muslim women, we find an utter lack of care. And I think, this is really important point in the sense that, what is it that we actually want for Muslim women? We're talking about gendered Islamophobia. As Muslim women in the world, what is it that we want? What would justice look like for Muslim women? And I think a lot of times for me that conversation centers around also safety, right? What would it mean to actually be safe? It would require system change. And I think that's why it's really useful to think about Muslim women's experiences, because if our safety, if justice for us requires us to be safe, that requires, all of these other systems to change. We can't have the border violence that we have right now that makes so many Muslim women across the world at the border and within this country unsafe, whether that's psychologically, emotionally, financially, physically, or otherwise. And I want to think about as well how, that kind of level of unsafety and the desire to co-opt us is also, has a long history. And, Dr. Amina alluded to this earlier, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these, but it is worth just pinpointing a few moments, maybe just to think about. Obviously, in the 1950s and 60s, you have the Algerian War of Independence against the French. And within that, many of you will know there were these unveiling ceremonies where French military wives basically unveiled Algerian women to a crowd of French officers. And usually these unveiling ceremonies were just for the metropole, they were for Paris, they were for the French government to feel that, they are successfully, achieving cultural hegemony, and not really much more than that. But what's interesting is that you can take this symbolic kind of co-option of the Muslim woman, this that proves something about Western society, and you can see that in 2001, before the invasion of Afghanistan, just before it, there's actually a picture, and I always find it fascinating to look at this. You can Google it later, of Oprah Winfrey, famous Oprah Winfrey, unveiling, taking the burqa off an Afghan woman in Madison Square Gardens in New York City. And, that's fascinating because it's sort of whetting the appetite for invading Afghanistan later in the year through this idea again of saving, of liberating, of co-opting, of engineering, of changing, transforming Muslim women. And I think that kind of history of linking us to how civilized Muslims are in general really informs lots of the things that I've mentioned so far. Hijab bans today, I think, is interesting. Don't face nearly as much outrage, legislative hijab and niqab bans as, for example, when Boris Johnson said, women who wear niqab look like letterboxes and bank robbers. I would say a lot of the left or liberal left kind of, made noises about how that's not okay and that's wrong. But when you have the state-sanctioned actual kind of laws that do essentially say, yes, Muslim women who wear niqab are criminals, are objects, are, to be covered and uncovered, you don't see the same outrage. And so I think, again, that's interesting to kind of just ponder on, because, this isn't something that actually is about caring about Muslim women. I want to kind of share a few more things. I'm just going to jump into another poem, and actually it kind of neatly comes after what Dr. Amina mentioned about. She talked already about Ofsted, and this poem I wrote it in response to Ofsted's announcement several years ago now, and I'll just use this to kind of talk about a final point before I wrap up. So what Ofsted had said was this: school inspectors in England have been told to start asking young girls in primary school why they are wearing a hijab in order to ascertain if they are being sexualized. You say you care about Muslim girls as if you care about the Muslim women they are standing in the pasts of. You say you care about the sexualization of Muslim girls, as if you do not turn a blind eye to the rise of Islamophobic misogyny, which sees cries like "give us a flash" leveled at women in hijab and niqab. You say you care about the sexualization of Muslim girls, as if you care about the sexualization of girls, as if you do not facilitate the categorization of the sexual future of babies' lives when you reduce them to girl. You say you care about the sexualization of Muslim girls as if we are victims of parents who are simultaneously sexually repressed and hypersexual, not so different from your colonial fantasies of us as sensual Eastern mysteries as well as suicide bomber threats. You say you care about Muslim girls, but you place our victimhood in ourselves. So keen to save us from our Muslimness that you distract from your own investment in our patriarchal domination. You pretend little girls are safe when their heads are uncovered. As if paedophilia is not endemic in this society, as if human trafficking is as underground as it is made out to be, as if billboard ads and television shows don't insist on the sexualization of girls from birth, as if you don't envision the sexual and marital futures of your babies from the moment go. You say you care about Muslim girls because you care about how we dress, but you do not care about Muslim girls when we are burning. You do not care about Muslim girls when we are screaming. You do not care about Muslim girls when we are drowning, when we are neglected, when we are at your borders, when we are starving, when we are in detention centers waiting for deportation, when we are in the bodies of mothers in detention centers waiting for deportation, when we are outspoken, asking for accountability for your war crimes, for recognition of your humanity, of our humanity. You do not care about Muslim girls when you bomb them into drone democracy, rape and death. You do not care about Muslim girls when we are asking. We are a symbolic signifiers for you, a way to talk about something else. And your concern for our sexualization is a way to stop talking about everything else. Our bodies are monuments to be covered or uncovered, depending what the exhibition is called this time. Will it be feminist reasons to extend the surveillance state, or reasons white supremacy must not be addressed as patriarchy? Do not say you care about Muslim girls when you care only to make out we are other, pretending our lives are completely incomprehensible through that our shadowy household activities can only be relayed through the mouths of babes. You do not care about Muslim girls because you do not care about girls or Muslims. So do not tell me you care about the sexualization of Muslim girls until you care about your investment in it. I recognize that I only have probably just under 10 minutes, so I'm just going to kind of whiz through a few final points that I wanted to share. I mean, on the back of that specific poem, I do just want to think about the ways that actually Islamophobia does collude with patriarchy. And what I mean by that is the way that where Muslim women do experience misogyny and patriarchy at the hands of Muslim men, whilst Islamophobia suggests that, you know, it is on the side of Muslim women against patriarchal Muslim men, it actually often collaborates to leave us between a rock and a hard place, where actually we know that speaking out against misogyny within our community leaves us at the whims of Islamophobia, because Islamophobic narratives weaponize that and say, see, we knew this is what happened, and therefore we do need to surveil your communities, and therefore we do need to, you know, criminalize you. And that actually leaves us as Muslim women much more vulnerable. And that can be really difficult to talk about as well. It's something I personally find quite difficult if you are outspoken and if you're kind of known for doing these, for kind of talking about these things. Actually, in reality, how much can you speak to every injustice when some of the injustices you face will be weaponized by other of the injustices? I just want to read a little part, kind of just to go into that a second. So moral panics about Muslim men's misogyny also do not protect Muslim women from it where it does exist. For instance, if a Muslim woman speaks out about Muslim men as patriarchal or wants to discuss cases of sexual or misogynistic abuse, our statements are weaponized against us to prove how much Muslims deserve criminalization, how in need of civilizing we are. Far from liberating Muslim women from any patriarchy, it means that Islamophobia colludes with patriarchy and forces us to maintain silence about gendered injustice. To take a personal example, and I think this is actually a really interesting example, right? It kind of shows us where secularism also plays into all of this. My mother once got into a disagreement with our local mosque board committee because of an inadequate quality of prayer space for women, something that we're all quite, you know, familiar with. But when I tweeted about the exchange between the mosque board and my mum, a BBC reporter instantly contacted me. I'd never had such a swift response from the BBC about any of my tweets about racism or Islamophobia, so I knew immediately that the reporter did not have either my mother's needs or my needs in mind. Their coverage would probably instead not grant us better quality of prayer space, which is what we wanted, or facilitate our ease of worship and access to worshipping Allah, because such priorities would not be considered valid demands for Muslim women to make in the first place. Instead, the story would probably evidence how misogynistic and backwards Muslims are, proof that harsher counter-extremism policing is needed to tackle the hateful beliefs of our mosque board. And if the mosque isn't already prevent funded, it would be. Our Friday khutbah would become replete with depoliticizing rhetoric. Far from assisting Muslim women, Islamophobic obsession with patriarchal Muslim men therefore colludes with patriarchal dynamics to punish, exclude, and silence Muslim women, especially when we do experience misogyny and gendered injustice. And that's really important to me, that final point, and when we're thinking about how we resist, because I think actually what we see is that wherever our kind of liberation or justice is kind of where there are interventions to apparently facilitate it, it usually leaves Muslim women as the losers. And we deserve more than that. We deserve to be complex, and we deserve justice kind of in any case. And so I want to end, I might be able to have time to perform a poem before I kind of completely close up, but I'll just end by saying I want us to remember that Islamophobia has beneficiaries, like I mentioned. You know, these things that occur are not just random. And in fact, I want to just sort of flip back for a really quick second, that Professor Fatima El-Tayeb, she makes a really good point, I think, that Muslim presence in Europe is actually not framed so much in the language of race, religion, or nation, but often more that of culture and gender. And that the essential distinction between Muslims and Europe, or the West, is presented as one where violence and patriarchy belong to Muslim culture and Islam and are external to the West. And so actually so much of constructing Islam like that and Muslims like that is about defining Western states themselves as not only peaceful, but inherently feminist and equal, since misogyny is framed as a cultural defect, not an operation of power. And so what you see is actually that misogyny itself becomes something that we can't really analyze properly, because we just say that, you know, it's this cultural kind of issue that people have. And I think what you also see happening with that is that it forces actually Muslim women also, you see the state basically collaborating in forcing Muslim women to rely on and remain in situations that are abusive, right? And one of the things I think about is that many women are forced, for example, to rely on abusive partners due to poverty and state neglect. And, you know, we know that the majority of women in UK prisons are survivors of domestic violence, which means that actually, you know, we can see they're more often punished than protected when they seek intervention. You're encouraged, you know, access the police, all these kinds of things. But actually, a justice system that over-criminalizes Black and brown women and victim blames all women leaves us unable to seek its protection from abusive situations that may lead to our deaths. And obviously undocumented and migrant women, they can't rely on those systems because they may end up deported. In the case of Muslim women specifically, as much as the state professes again that Muslim men's violence is a concern to it, structural Islamophobia means that those women who may experience domestic violence at the hands of Muslim men are often forced to stay in those situations because the racialization of Muslims as threats mean that if we involve the police or social workers or other formal institutions into our families, that could lead to us or our partners being reported to prevent, being incarcerated. You could even have your children removed, your citizenship stripped. So what you see is that it's not only racist, the ways that this kind of this construction of Muslims as patriarchal is not only racist, but it also obscures the connection between interpersonal violence and state violence. That means that the state actually is directly involved in patriarchy and misogyny through the criminal justice system. And it is an accomplice, I would say, in sexual violence, not a protector from it. And I think that's really important just as a thought there. But yeah, sorry, back to wrapping up. I kind of went on a tangent there. Back to wrapping up. You know, I think we have to remember there are beneficiaries, right? And there always have been beneficiaries to the way Muslim women are constructed, as we saw in the past through colonialism. Colonialism is a financial, material, you know, project. There are massive winners, people who get resources, entire states that are built on the back of it. And so those constructions of Muslims then had beneficiaries. But that exists too today. You know, right now, the beneficiaries of Islamophobic narratives are arms companies the world over who make billions selling arms in the name of security, selling security technology, selling drones, selling all sorts of border technologies, stopping Muslims, you know, crossing borders and non-Muslims crossing borders, but through the narrative that it is a Muslim threat. And the other beneficiary, of course, is the state, and that states across the world who, in the name of countering a Muslim threat, you know, can coerce and control all of us, can surveil everybody because everybody kind of accepts that there is an endless need for security. And ultimately, this is a genocidal logic, is something that I would like to argue, that actually, because the idea that you need to end the Muslim threat, but you place the threat of Muslimness within Muslims, leads you with only one conclusion, which is that you need to end Muslimness. And this is all, you know, kind of leads to us thinking that the only solution to anything is policing. And actually that brings me to my final point. I promise this is my final point, which is that I think in general, we need to kind of be careful about not collaborating with the very forces that do oppress us. And what I mean by that is going back to what I said at the beginning, that, you know, thinking about hate crimes as the primary kind of way in which we experience Islamophobia also forces us to rely on reporting to the police, when actually it's the police and the institutions like the Home Office that structurally perpetrate so much of the Islamophobia we face. You know, like I talked about, those individuals on the street level who may, you know, express Islamophobia through physical or verbal harassment are only kind of acting out what the state acts out every single day. And so I think we should be careful about thinking how we resist. And I'm not saying, you know, don't kind of take the precautions you need to feel safe. But what I am saying is, let's be thoughtful. Are we actually just solidifying and reinforcing the very systems that are you know, that actually do benefit from and reap the reward of Islamophobia? And secondly, to not seek limited gains, right? I think we need to ask now, is representation enough? Does it tackle the root? Because disproving representations and stereotype, it can be, I think, a distraction. You know, stereotypes don't exist because they haven't been disproven. They exist because they do important work for those beneficiaries that we've talked about. So as a final thought, you know, to me, reclaiming the narrative is actually about revealing the narrative, showing that the narrative has beneficiaries. It's not just enough to have our own counter narrative. I think that's vital, that's crucial, but that counter narrative has to show why the other one exists. It's not just about one narrative versus another, because we have to recognize it's not just two versions of events. There is one version of events that upholds a world of violence that we experience every single day. And then there is our version of events that must reveal what is going on there, and that this is rooted in injustice. Thank you for listening to me for so long. Sorry that it was quite so long. Yeah.
It didn't feel long at all. You know, time just flew. It was just, your poetry has so much passion, and what you speak about has so much passion as well.
Jazakallah khairan.